My unemployed husband, who lives completely off my income, texted me while I was on a high-stakes work trip. He demanded his monthly $5,000 allowance for his failing podcast and threatened to divorce me if I did not pay up. I simply replied that I had already divorced him yesterday. His response was a confused, "Huh." But the real shock came 60 seconds later when I froze his credit cards and uncovered a transaction that exposed a massive web of family lies involving my arrogant brother-in-law. I am Chloe, 34 years old, and a crisis PR manager. I clean up catastrophic messes for a living. I silence scandals and make sure billionaires sleep soundly. Dealing with high-pressure situations is second nature. It was a Tuesday evening in London. The rain was lashing against the windows of my hotel suite. I had just wrapped up a grueling negotiation to salvage a corporate reputation. I was exhausted, running on stale coffee and adrenaline. I dropped my briefcase on the sofa and kicked off my heels, ready to collapse into bed. That is when my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting a confirmation email. Instead, it was a text from Marcus, my husband of 6 years. "Why have you not sent my $5,000 allowance for this month? My podcast needs funding right now. Do you want me to get mad and divorce you?" I stared at the screen, letting the audacity sink in. Marcus had not held a steady job in 4 years. He called himself a creative entrepreneur, but his reality consisted of sleeping until noon, buying expensive recording equipment on my credit cards, and recording a sports podcast that averaged 14 listeners a week. I paid our mortgage, I paid his car lease, and gave him a generous stipend to keep the peace. And yet here he was threatening me with divorce over a delayed allowance while I was working across the globe to fund his lifestyle. For years I played the supportive wife, swallowing my frustration to maintain a happy image. My family always told me I needed to work harder to keep a man, especially since my older sister Letitia married an allegedly wealthy white investment banker named Preston. They constantly reminded me my corporate ambition was unattractive, and I should be grateful Marcus put up with my demanding schedule. But sitting in that hotel room, something snapped. The fog of obligation lifted. I did not type a long explanation or apologize. I simply tapped out a 5-word response. "I divorced you yesterday." I hit send and watched the checkmark appear. 10 seconds later, my screen lit up with his reply. Huh. I tossed the phone, feeling a massive weight lift. What Marcus did not know was he had ignored legal mail for months. When I slipped divorce papers into a pile of podcast copyright forms, he scribbled his signature across the default judgment paperwork without reading a single page. The judge finalized it while I was flying over the Atlantic. But my peace lasted exactly 1 minute. My phone suddenly exploded with notifications. The family group chat vibrated incessantly. Calls from my mother, Loretta, flashed across the screen. When I did not answer, she left a frantic voicemail. I tapped the audio file and her shrill voice echoed through the room. "Chloe, what is wrong with you? Marcus is at Letitia's house crying in the driveway. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. You abandon your husband to fly to Europe and play sick mind games. Call him right now, apologize, and send him his money. Preston is hosting a dinner for his investors tonight, and your selfish behavior is ruining the aesthetic. You better fix this before you lose the only man willing to put up with your struggle energy." I listened to her entire rant without flinching. My mother was more concerned about Preston and his investor dinner than my well-being. She viewed my hard-earned career as struggle energy while worshipping the ground my white brother-in-law walked on because he projected old money wealth. I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. It was time to cut the dead weight entirely. I opened my banking app, navigating directly to the joint accounts and secondary cards I had opened for Marcus. My finger hovered over the Freeze All Accounts button. I felt no guilt, no hesitation, only cold, calculated precision. I pressed confirm. The screen flashed green, indicating the cards were now entirely deactivated. I walked over to the minibar to pour myself a glass of sparkling water, finally ready to enjoy my evening. But before the water even hit the glass, my phone screen lit up with an urgent push notification from my fraud protection service. I picked it up and read the alert. Transaction declined. $5,000 transfer attempted. I frowned, staring at the red text. Marcus had immediately tried to wire his entire monthly allowance out of the account the second I sent my text. But it was not the declined status that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was the listed recipient of the attempted transfer. The notification clearly stated, Beneficiary Preston Investments, LLC. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my mind racing. Why would my unemployed ex-husband be urgently trying to wire his podcast allowance directly into my arrogant brother-in-law's corporate investment firm? Marcus knew nothing about investing, and Preston despised Marcus. None of it made any logical sense unless there was a massive financial deception happening right under my nose. The puzzle pieces started clicking together, forming a terrifying picture of family betrayal that I had to completely expose now. I booked the first available red-eye flight out of London and landed at O'Hare before the sun even fully crested the skyline. I bypassed my own apartment and drove my rental car straight toward the affluent northern suburbs. Today was the annual family cookout celebrating my parents' anniversary, and it was being held at my older sister Letitia's sprawling gated mansion. Pulling up to the wrought iron gates, I pressed the intercom button and waited for the heavy doors to swing open. The long driveway was lined with imported luxury cars, reflecting the meticulously curated image Letitia and her husband Preston worked so hard to project. I parked behind a pristine Porsche, took a deep breath and grabbed my bag. I had not even bothered to change out of my tailored navy business suit. I strode around the side of the stone facade toward the expansive backyard. The smell of smoked brisket and the sound of classic rhythm and blues music filled the humid Chicago air. The lush green grass was perfectly manicured, without a single blade out of place. Family members gathered in small clusters holding expensive drinks and laughing loudly at jokes that were not really funny at all. As soon as my heels clicked onto the imported travertine patio, the music seemed to lower. Letitia spotted me instantly. She wore a flowing designer silk caftan and held a crystal champagne flute. She looked me up and down with a practiced look of disdain before projecting her voice so the surrounding relatives could hear every word. "Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," she declared, sauntering over. "And in a boardroom suit, no less. You do realize this is a family cookout, right, Chloe? You look like you are about to depose someone." "I am here because we need to have a serious conversation," I said, keeping my voice measured. Letitia laughed, a high-pitched sound devoid of any real warmth. "You are always so tense. You need to learn how to relax and enjoy the luxury lifestyle. Look around you, Chloe. If you played your cards right and softened up a bit, maybe you could afford a backyard like this instead of working yourself to death for a paycheck." Before I could respond, her husband Preston emerged from the outdoor kitchen. He wore a crisp linen shirt unbuttoned perfectly at the collar, projecting his usual old money arrogance. He held out a warm, cheap domestic beer, pushing it into my hand despite my refusal. He smirked, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Letitia is right, Chloe," he said loudly. "You have got to dial back that aggressive corporate energy. It is a known fact that Black women who work too hard and act too independent end up pushing their men away. You need to learn how to be softer, more accommodating. It is the only way a marriage survives." His incredibly condescending tone made my blood boil instantly. He stood there acting like he was an absolute authority on relationships while constantly disrespecting the very people who welcomed him into their home. He genuinely believed that his white privilege gave him the right to constantly judge my life choices. I stared at Preston, tightening my grip on the cheap aluminum can. My mother Loretta and my father stepped away from the grilling station to join the spectacle. Instead of defending me, my mother immediately took Letitia's side. "Do not look at Preston like that, Chloe," my mother scolded, wagging a finger at me. "He is giving you solid advice. You should be taking notes from your sister. Preston provides for her beautifully because she knows how to be a supportive wife. You are entirely too selfish with your career." My father chimed in, crossing his arms over his chest. "Your mother is right. We raised you girls to understand the value of family and social standing. Letitia married into a prestigious family and understands her role. You just chase corporate titles and ignore your husband. It is unfeminine. Your aggressive behavior is exactly why Marcus is so unhappy. The absolute hypocrisy of their words washed over me. For my entire life, they had praised Letitia for marrying what they perceived as wealthy white status, while simultaneously degrading my self-made success. I paid for my own education, started my own PR firm from nothing, and funded my own life. She married a man who constantly demeaned our culture while flaunting his supposed superiority. Yet in my parents' eyes, I was the failure because I did not rely on a man to validate my existence. I looked directly at my mother, preparing to expose the fraudulent wire transfer from my bank account. Their constant need to diminish my accomplishments just to make Letitia feel better about her superficial life was utterly exhausting, and I was finally done putting up with it. Before I could even open my mouth, the heavy glass patio doors slammed open with a violent crash. Marcus came storming out of the mansion. His face was blotchy, and his eyes were wide with manufactured panic. He wore designer clothes paid for entirely by my hard work, but right now, he was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, making sure every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in the backyard turned to watch the spectacle unfold. "She froze my accounts," he screamed, his voice cracking with theatrical desperation. "Look at her, everyone. This is the woman I sacrificed my own creative career for. She froze my credit cards while I was trying to secure funding for my business. She is financially abusing me, and now she is trying to kick me out on the street with absolutely nothing." The entire backyard fell dead silent. Every single pair of eyes shifted toward me, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to cower or apologize to him, but I just stood there unbothered. My parents did not miss a single beat. They immediately marched right past me to console the grown man crying on the patio. My mother, Loretta, quickly wrapped her arms tightly around Marcus, patting his back while casting a look of absolute disgust and deep disappointment in my direction. The nosy neighbors peering over the manicured green hedges were getting quite the show. My father crossed his arms and shook his head, muttering about how the corporate world had stripped me of my femininity. Loretta pointed a manicured finger at my face right there on the travertine patio. "You are a terrible wife, Chloe," she announced, her voice echoing over the quiet rhythm and blues music. "A man needs to feel respected in his own home. You have emasculated him with your paychecks and your demands. If you would just learn to be submissive, maybe you could hold on to a husband. Look at your sister Letitia. She treats Preston like a king, and in return he provides her with a beautiful life. You are throwing away a perfectly good marriage because you refuse to compromise." I stared at the woman who brought me into this world, listening to her actively defend a parasite who was draining my bank accounts. Letitia smirked from her lounge chair, swirling her champagne, while Preston nodded approvingly at my mother's archaic lecture. My father chimed in, telling me to march inside, write Marcus a check, and apologize for my disrespectful behavior. They were all so deeply invested in the illusion of traditional gender roles that they gladly offered me up as the sacrificial lamb. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or launch into a defensive rant about the late nights, the unpaid bills, or the sheer exhaustion of carrying a grown adult. I simply straightened my tailored jacket and walked deliberately toward the outdoor grilling station where Marcus had retreated. He was holding a pair of heavy metal tongs, flipping a massive rack of ribs, pretending to be the victimized patriarch of our shattered household. I stopped inches from his face, invading his personal space, until he was forced to meet my gaze. The smell of hickory smoke and barbecue sauce hung heavily in the humid air. I reached out and firmly gripped the metal tongs. He tried to pull away, but I yanked them from his hand and tossed them onto the granite counter with a loud clatter. Everyone went perfectly still, anticipating a screaming match. I leaned in close, lowering my voice so only he could hear the devastating truth. "You are not a victim, Marcus," I whispered, my tone dripping with absolute ice. "You are just incredibly lazy and profoundly stupid." His eyes darted around nervously. "You cannot financially cut me off, Chloe," he hissed back, keeping his voice low to match mine. "The law protects spouses. I know my rights." I smiled a genuine, chilling smile. "You would know your rights if you ever bothered to read the mail," I replied. "For 6 months, you ignored every certified letter sent to our home. You threw notices from the county clerk directly into the trash because you thought they were credit card bills. You were too busy playing creative genius to manage your own life. So I made it very easy for you." Marcus blinked, his bravado faltering. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "2 months ago, you asked me to help you file the trademark paperwork for that ridiculous sports podcast," I whispered, watching the color slowly drain from his cheeks. "I printed out a stack of documents and put sticky notes everywhere you needed to sign. You were so eager to get your fake business off the ground that you grabbed a pen and signed every single page without reading a single word." His breathing hitched. "You did not," he choked out. "I slipped the divorce settlement right into the middle of your podcast copyright forms," I whispered, leaning even closer to deliver the final blow. "You signed a full waiver of your right to contest the filing. You signed away any claim to alimony. You signed a default judgment granting me the house, the bank accounts, and every single asset I brought into the marriage. The judge finalized the paperwork yesterday morning while I was in London. We are legally entirely divorced, and you own absolutely nothing." Marcus staggered backward as if I had physically struck him. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered terror. He looked down at his designer shoes, then back up at my calm face. The reality of his catastrophic laziness was crashing down on him in real time. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His hands began to shake violently. He bumped against the grill, sending a platter of freshly smoked ribs crashing onto the pristine patio stones. Barbecue sauce splattered across the travertine and onto the cuffs of his expensive trousers, but he did not even flinch. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air as the world he had been freely coasting through evaporated into thin air. He looked toward my parents and Letitia, who were watching in confused silence, waiting for him to explain what I had just said. He took a deep, ragged breath, preparing to scream the truth to the entire cookout. But before a single syllable could escape his mouth, a bony hand clamped down on my wrist with astonishing strength. I gasped as Grandma Hattie, my mother's sharp-witted 78-year-old mother, yanked me backward. Big Mama, as we all called her, had been sitting quietly in a wicker chair, sipping sweet tea and observing the chaos. She did not say a word to Marcus or my parents. She just locked her piercing dark eyes onto mine and dragged me forcefully away from the grill, pulling me straight toward the house and shoving me into the dark walk-in pantry. The heavy wooden door of the pantry clicked shut, plunging us into the scent of dried rosemary and imported olive oil. The muffled sounds of Marcus dropping the barbecue platter and gasping for air were barely audible through the thick walls. I expected my grandmother to scold me. I braced myself for another lecture about family loyalty and keeping the peace. Instead, the frail, stooped posture she maintained outside vanished completely. Grandma Hattie stood up perfectly straight in the dim light. Her dark eyes, usually clouded with the feigned confusion of old age, were terrifyingly sharp and completely lucid. She reached into the deep pocket of her floral cardigan and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. Before I could ask a single question, she shoved the cold metal device deep into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket. Her grip on my arm was like a vice, betraying a strength she constantly hid from my mother and sister. "Check the white boy's safe," she whispered, her voice a low, raspy hiss that demanded absolute obedience. "They all think I am senile. They think I just sit in that wicker chair and watch the grass grow. But I see every single thing that happens in this family. I see the fake watches he wears. I see the bills Letitia hides in the recycling bin. I see your parents blinding themselves to the truth just so they can brag at their country club." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the sudden shift. "Big Mama, what is on this drive?" I asked, keeping my voice hushed. "The truth," she replied simply. "Preston thinks he is the smartest man in the room, but he is sloppy. He leaves his home office unlocked when he drinks his expensive whiskey." I took that drive right off his mahogany desk while Letitia was busy agonizing over her catering menu. You are the only one in this family with the brains and the backbone to do what needs to be done. You clean up messes for a living, Chloe. Now it is time to clean up our own backyard. She released my wrist and took a deep breath. The sharp matriarch instantly melted away, replaced once again by the fragile elderly woman who needed help walking down the patio steps. Now you get out of here before your mother realizes you are gone, she instructed, her voice trembling with manufactured weakness. Go out the side door through the catering kitchen. I am going to give you a head start. Do not look back. Before I could even thank her, Big Mama pushed open the pantry door and stumbled out into the hallway leading back to the patio. I stayed hidden in the shadows, watching through the crack in the door hinge. She took 2 steps toward the sliding glass doors where the family was gathered around a hyperventilating Marcus. Then she threw her hand dramatically over her forehead, let out a piercing theatrical shriek, and collapsed onto the plush outdoor sectional sofa. Lord have mercy! My heart is fluttering! Big Mama wailed, her voice projecting across the entire manicured lawn. The heat is taking me. Loretta, Letitia, come help your mother. I am fading fast. The timing was absolutely impeccable. Marcus had just managed to catch his breath enough to start screaming about suing me for alimony and emotional distress. But Big Mama's spectacular performance instantly derailed his victim narrative. My mother gasped, completely abandoning Marcus and rushing toward the sofa. Letitia dropped her crystal champagne flute onto the patio stones, shattering it into dozens of pieces as she sprinted to her grandmother's side. Fan me, Big Mama demanded, waving her hand weakly in the air. Get me some ice water and sweet tea. My blood pressure is plummeting. Preston, stop standing there like a useless statue and fetch me a cold towel. The entire backyard descended into absolute chaos. My father was shouting for someone to call a doctor. Letitia was frantically waving a glossy magazine at Big Mama's face. Preston looked entirely annoyed that the attention had shifted away from his luxurious hosting abilities, but he reluctantly jogged inside toward the kitchen to fetch the ice. Marcus was left standing alone by the ruined grill, sobbing into his hands, completely ignored by the very people who had just defended his honor moments before. This was my window. I slipped out of the pantry and moved quickly and quietly down the back hallway. I bypassed the main living areas, dodging a confused catering staff member, and pushed through the heavy wooden side door. The humid Chicago air hit my face as I stepped onto the cobblestone path that led around the perimeter of the sprawling estate. I did not run. Running would draw attention. I speed-walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who had a strict schedule to keep. I rounded the towering privacy hedges and reached the front gates. The valet attendant was distracted by his phone, completely missing my silent exit. I clicked my key fob, and the lights of my rental car flashed in the distance. I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. I immediately pressed the lock button, the mechanical click echoing in the quiet interior of the vehicle. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a mixture of adrenaline and sheer disbelief at the events that had just transpired. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver USB drive. The metal was warm from my body heat. I grabbed my work laptop from the passenger seat, flipped open the screen, and waited for the operating system to boot up. The bright glow of the screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. I plugged the drive into the port, and a window instantly popped up on my desktop. The folder was labeled simply Preston Financials. I expected to find a fake investment portfolio. I expected to see empty offshore accounts, forged banking statements, or evidence that my brother-in-law was running a cheap Ponzi scheme to fund Letitia's designer wardrobe. I clicked on the folder, bracing myself for a mess of corporate fraud. Dozens of PDF files populated the screen. They were not organized by date or account number. They were haphazardly saved, a digital paper trail of a man desperately trying to hide his tracks. I hovered my cursor over the very first document in the list. The file name was a string of random numbers. I double-clicked it. The document opened, expanding to fill my entire screen. It was not a bank statement. It was not an investment portfolio. It was a formal legal document from the county circuit court. I scanned the bold black text at the top of the page, my eyes straining to comprehend the words. Final notice of foreclosure and intent to seize property. I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. Why would Preston have a foreclosure notice? I scanned down to the property details section, expecting to see the address of Letitia's rented mansion. But the address listed on the legal document was not in a wealthy, gated community. It was a residential address on the south side of Chicago. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the street name instantly. I looked at the section labeled property owners, and my blood turned entirely to ice. The names printed on the final foreclosure notice were Loretta and Robert, my parents. And the property slated to be seized by the bank was Big Mama's historic, fully paid-off home. I stared at the foreclosure notice until the letters blurred together. My parents secretly mortgaged the only true generational wealth our family owned. The sheer magnitude of their recklessness threatened to suffocate me, but I refused to panic. Panic is for amateurs. I shoved the car into drive and sped away from the gated community, leaving the sounds of Marcus whining entirely behind me. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my quiet townhouse, my mind was operating in full corporate salvage mode. I marched inside, locked the door, and set up my command center at the table. I poured cold water, opened my laptop, and dialed a number I usually reserved for executives caught in embezzlement scandals. David was the lead forensic accountant at a top-tier crisis management firm and owed me a massive favor. When he answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I was sending a highly encrypted file dump and needed a deep dive into every LLC, shell corporation, and wire transfer listed. I needed to know exactly where the money from Big Mama's house went. David promised to put his best team on it immediately. While I waited, I began combing through the superficial layers of the USB drive myself. Big Mama was right. She saw absolutely everything. She had somehow managed to copy Preston's personal digital archives. It took less than 2 hours for David to call back, and his tone was deadly serious. He told me to sit down before peeling back the layers of my brother-in-law's supposed luxury lifestyle. First, he shattered the illusion of Preston's old money heritage. Preston always claimed his wealth was tied up in generations of East Coast trusts. The truth was, his family had filed for bankruptcy twice in the late 90s. He grew up deeply in debt and possessed zero inherited wealth. Every story he ever told my parents about his prestigious lineage was a complete fabrication. David moved on to Preston Investments, LLC. He explained that it was not a legitimate investment firm at all. It was a classic rudimentary Ponzi scheme. Preston was taking capital from new investors to pay off the dividends of older investors while skimming massive amounts off the top to fund his personal life. And that sprawling gated mansion where Letitia was hosting her cookout was not owned by them. David uncovered the lease. It was a high-end month-to-month rental, and the landlord had just issued a notice because they were 90 days behind on their exorbitant rent payments. The luxury cars in the driveway were leased. The designer clothes were bought on credit. My sister was living in a fragile house of cards that was rapidly collapsing. My phone vibrated violently against the table, shaking me from the financial reports. The caller ID flashed Letitia's name. I took a slow, deliberate breath and answered the call. I expected her to be screaming about the scene I caused, but she sounded shockingly calm and utterly arrogant. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I now held the blueprint to her impending financial ruin. "Chloe," she sighed dramatically into the receiver. "I am only calling because Mom is too upset to deal with your childish behavior right now. You really ruined the vibe of my party." I stayed silent, allowing her to dig her grave. Letitia continued, her tone dripping with unearned superiority. "Listen, Marcus is a wreck. You blindsided him with those divorce papers, and that was incredibly toxic of you. But we are a family of faith, and we believe in grace. So here is what is going to happen. Preston knows a fantastic divorce attorney downtown. He is expensive, but will make sure Marcus gets a fair settlement. I expect you to pay the retainer tomorrow morning. It is the Christian thing to do. You cannot just discard a man because you prioritize your little PR job over your marriage." I pressed my lips together, suppressing a laugh. She was sitting in a rented mansion, 90 days past due, on rent demanding, I pay for my unemployed ex-husband's lawyer using the salary she constantly belittled. I will not be paying for anything, Letitia. I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. Marcus signed an ironclad post-nuptial agreement tied to the default judgment. He gets nothing. Letitia scoffed loudly. We will see about that. Preston said he will personally fund the lawsuit if he has to, just to teach you a lesson about respect. You always were the bitter sister, Chloe. I ended the call without another word. The sheer delusion of her threats was mind-boggling. Preston could not even afford his own rent, let alone fund a high-stakes legal battle against my corporate lawyers. I tossed my phone onto the table and rubbed my temples, trying to process the absolute mess my family had created. My parents had sacrificed Big Mama's paid-off home to impress a man who was actively scamming them. They had mortgaged their own mother's safety to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. Just as I was about to call David back to ask about the specific wire transfers, my laptop chimed with a priority encrypted text message. It was from David. His message was marked urgent. I clicked the notification, and the text expanded across my screen. Chloe, you need to look at the money laundering pathways I just emailed you. Preston's LLC has been washing dirty funds using a series of dummy corporations to hide the trail from federal regulators. I opened the attached spreadsheet and scanned the highlighted rows. My heart stopped beating as my eyes landed on the third dummy corporation listed. The $5,000 allowance I had been sending Marcus every single month was not going toward a failed sports show. One of the primary corporations Preston was using to wash his stolen Ponzi scheme money was Marcus and his fake podcast, LLC. The horrifying reality of the spreadsheet paralyzed me for a fraction of a second before my corporate survival instincts violently kicked in. Marcus was not merely a lazy freeloader draining my resources for a pipe dream. He was an active money mule. The puzzle pieces locked together with sickening clarity. Every single month, I dutifully transferred $5,000 into his separate business account. I believed I was funding recording equipment, soundproofing materials, and marketing for his sports podcast. I endured his endless complaints about needing more capital to truly capture his creative vision. Instead of building a business, my husband was funneling my hard-earned corporate salary directly into Preston's fraudulent enterprise. My money, the capital I generated by working grueling 80-hour weeks and navigating brutal boardroom politics, was being used to keep a sinking Ponzi scheme afloat. I had unknowingly financed the very illusion my family used to constantly belittle me. I pictured Preston standing on that immaculate travertine patio holding his cheap beer and lecturing me about traditional marriage. He had the absolute audacity to look down on my career while secretly using my paychecks to cover the lease on his imported luxury cars and Letitia's designer caftans. Marcus had colluded with the very man who openly mocked our culture, handing over my money so Preston could continue playing the role of the wealthy patriarch. The betrayal ran so deep it bypassed anger and settled into a realm of pure absolute ice. They had turned my marriage into a money laundering operation. I slammed my laptop shut and grabbed my phone. I bypassed my regular contacts and directly dialed the personal cell phone of my senior wealth manager at the bank. It was late on a Sunday, but when you hold 8 figures in corporate and personal assets, they answer on the first ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I issued a series of rapid-fire directives that would make a military commander proud. I ordered an immediate hard freeze on any joint accounts that had not already been dissolved by the default judgment. I demanded a complete forensic audit of every transfer I had made to the podcast LLC over the last 2 years. I needed certified digital and physical copies showing the exact dates and times those funds left my control. My mind was racing 3 steps ahead, mapping out the impending legal fallout. When a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude collapses, it does not just fade away quietly. It detonates. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and the Internal Revenue Service would inevitably descend on Preston Investments, LLC. Federal agents would follow every single digital footprint and wire transfer straight back to Marcus. If I remained financially tied to him in any capacity, the government could freeze my corporate accounts, seize my personal assets, and drag my PR firm into a massive federal indictment. I instructed my wealth manager to build an impenetrable financial firewall between my remaining portfolio and anything bearing my ex-husband's name. I then conferenced in my corporate legal counsel. I ordered them to review the divorce decree the judge had signed yesterday morning. I needed absolute reassurance that the post-nuptial agreement insulated me from any criminal liabilities Marcus might incur. My lawyer confirmed that the default judgment severed all financial ties, retroactively protecting my assets from his impending federal doom. I let out a long, ragged breath. I was legally clean. The fortress was built. Now I just needed to watch the invaders destroy themselves. Just as I disconnected the call with my legal team, my phone screen lit up with a joint incoming call from my parents. The caller ID showed my father's cell phone, but I knew my mother would be hovering over the speakerphone. A tiny, foolish part of me hoped they were calling to ask if I was okay. I wondered if seeing Marcus drop that platter of ribs and hyperventilate had finally broken through their delusion. I tapped the screen to accept the call and put it on speaker. "Chloe, what on earth is wrong with you?" My mother's voice, shrill and frantic, instantly filled the quiet townhouse. "Your sister is practically in tears because you ruined a perfectly elegant afternoon. We had the Winston family coming over for cocktails, and instead we are dealing with a crisis." I sat back in my chair staring at the ceiling. They were not calling to check on me. They were calling to manage their social calendar. My father took over, his voice carrying that familiar booming authority he used to dictate my life choices. "We are not calling to listen to your excuses, Chloe. You have pushed this independent woman act entirely too far. Marcus is a wreck. He is sitting in our living room right now claiming you have locked him out of all the accounts and filed bogus legal papers behind his back. We will not tolerate this level of disrespect to a husband. We are legally divorced, Dad," I said, my voice deadpan. "He signed the papers. He ignored the mail. He is entirely responsible for his own situation. He was focused on building his brand," my mother snapped, defending a man who had just been exposed as a fraud. "You were supposed to support him. Now you have humiliated him in front of our neighbors. You need to fix this immediately." "Fix what exactly?" I asked, tracing the edge of my laptop. "Your father and I have discussed the situation with Preston." My mother continued, her tone shifting from frantic to dictatorial. "Preston agrees that your actions are highly irregular and frankly vindictive. To smooth things over and prevent a massive public scandal, we have decided you are going to transfer the deed to your downtown condo into Marcus' name." I stopped breathing. The sheer magnitude of their entitlement was staggering. The downtown property was a luxury penthouse I purchased entirely with my own bonuses 3 years before I even met Marcus. It was solely in my name and worth over $2 million. "You want me to give him my penthouse?" I asked, ensuring I heard them correctly. "It is the only logical solution," my father barked, clearly agitated by my lack of immediate compliance. Preston reviewed the situation, and he said the law requires a 50-50 split of all assets in a marriage. "You cannot just steal everything out from under him. You are acting like a spoiled child. Give him the condo so he has a place to live and capital to restart his business. Do not be greedy, Chloe." My hand tightened around my phone. They were taking legal advice from a con artist running a shell corporation. They were trying to strip me of my hard-earned real estate to comfort a money mule. "We are not asking you, Chloe. We are telling you." My father demanded, his voice echoing through the speakerphone. "Preston is helping us manage our retirement accounts and our real estate investments. He is setting us up for a very lucrative future, and we cannot have you embarrassing the family with this selfish behavior." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that crackled through the phone speaker. "You honestly believe Preston is building your retirement?" I asked, gripping the cold edge of my dining table. "I am not giving Marcus a single dime, and I am certainly not handing over the deed to a penthouse I bought with my own money before he even entered the picture. If your precious son-in-law wants a luxury place to live, he can go fill out a job application like the rest of the functioning adult world." My mother immediately snatched the phone away from my father. Her voice shifted instantly from dictatorial to a high-pitched, weaponized whine. "Chloe, you are being deliberately cruel," she cried, her tone dripping with manufactured agony. "Your selfishness is literally killing this family. Do you know Big Mama collapsed on the patio right after you snuck out like a thief in the night? Her blood pressure spiked dangerously high because of the toxic environment you created. You are putting your own grandmother in the hospital just to prove a point about your bank accounts." The sheer audacity of Loretta using Big Mama as a pawn made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. I knew exactly why my brilliant grandmother had faked that fainting spell. She did it to give me the perfect distraction so I could escape the estate with the silver USB drive hidden in my pocket. But I could not reveal that I knew the truth, or that Big Mama was the ultimate mastermind behind this operation. I simply told my mother that her health was not my responsibility to manage, especially when I was the only person in the family actively trying to protect her. A loud, violent scuffling sound echoed over the line, followed by the sharp click of acrylic nails grabbing the receiver. Letitia had wrestled the phone away from our mother. Her voice was shrill and filled with the specific kind of venom she usually reserved for service workers who got her coffee order wrong. "You are so pathetic, Chloe." Letitia sneered, her words slurring slightly from the champagne she had been drinking all afternoon. "You sit in your empty little townhouse thinking you are so superior because you work 80 hours a week. But you just clean up messes for rich people. That is all your corporate public relations firm does. You are a glorified maid in a business suit." I stayed entirely silent, letting her arrogant rant echo through my kitchen. This toxic dynamic was a perfectly preserved relic from our childhood. Whenever I earned an academic award or secured a college scholarship, my parents would immediately buy Letitia a designer handbag or fund an expensive vacation to ensure she never felt overshadowed by my hard work. She was conditioned from birth to believe she was inherently superior simply because she existed, while I was expected to grind for every single scrap of validation. She married a man who projected the loud, aggressive illusion of generational wealth, and my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. "You will never have real wealth like Preston's family." Letitia continued, her voice rising in pitch as she fed on her own delusion. "You are just a bitter, lonely workaholic who could not even keep a husband entertained. Marcus is a creative visionary. He just needed a little support to get his podcast off the ground. But you are too obsessed with your own bank account to see the big picture. Preston actually understands how legacy wealth operates. He knows how to leverage assets to build a lasting empire." I let her speak, taking meticulous mental notes of every delusion she spouted. My mind was operating with surgical precision, calculating the exact depth of the fraud Preston had orchestrated. Legacy wealth. I echoed, keeping my tone deliberately flat and devoid of emotion. "Is that what Preston calls it when he hides from his landlords to avoid paying rent?" Letitia gasped loudly. It was a sharp, aggressive intake of breath, signaling she had completely lost control of her temper. "You do not know anything about high-level finance," she shrieked, her voice vibrating with pure rage. "Preston is a genius. He is doing this entire family a massive favor by managing our portfolios. He is taking this family to the next level of elite status. He even used Big Mama's equity for a bridge loan to secure a commercial real estate deal that will guarantee our legacy for generations. We are going to be set for life, while you die alone with your corporate spreadsheets." The words hung in the air, suspended like a toxic cloud of impending doom. A bridge loan. I did not bother engaging with her unhinged insult. I simply reached forward and pressed the red glowing button on my screen, severing the connection mid-sentence. The silence in my kitchen was absolute and terrifying. The horrifying realization of Letitia's arrogant slip-up washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Preston had not just stolen my parents' liquid retirement funds. He had actively leveraged the only piece of genuine paid-off real estate our family possessed to feed his collapsing Ponzi scheme. My fingers flew across my laptop keyboard with frantic precision. I closed the corporate forensic files and opened a new secure browser tab. I went straight to the county assessor website, bypassing the public search portals. I used my professional credentials to access the expedited real estate records database that I typically used for corporate background checks. I typed in the address of Big Mama's historic Greystone house on the south side of Chicago. That house had been in our family for over 40 years. My grandfather worked grueling double shifts at the steel mill to pay off that mortgage before he died. It was a sacred, untouchable asset that represented everything our family had overcome. It was supposed to be the one safe haven no one could ever take away. It was the physical embodiment of our actual legacy. I hit the enter key and waited for the server to fetch the property deed history. The loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds before the official document populated on my high-resolution screen. I scrolled past the original deed details and stopped dead at the bottom of the page. A massive red flag indicator flashed next to the current property status. 2 months ago, a new legal filing had been recorded against the residential address. It was a massive commercial lien. Preston had successfully convinced my parents to sign over the equity of their own mother's home to secure a $600,000 loan for his fake investment firm, and the bank had just issued a final notice of foreclosure. I scrutinized the digitized legal documents attached to the county property records. My eyes scanned the blurry PDF of the deed transfer and the subsequent mortgage agreement, searching for the fatal flaw. There it was, hiding in plain sight at the bottom of the 3rd page. Big Mama's signature was entirely absent from the multi-thousand-dollar loan origination documents. In its place was my father's sloppy scrawl, designated as the authorized signatory under a durable power of attorney. The sickening reality of their deception crashed over me, destroying any remaining illusion of family loyalty. My parents, completely blinded by their desperate thirst for elite social status and thoroughly brainwashed by Preston's carefully curated facade of white wealth, had manipulated their own mother. Big Mama trusted them implicitly with her affairs. They must have slipped the power of attorney paperwork into a stack of routine medical or insurance documents, casually telling her it was just a standard administrative formality. They legally hijacked her autonomy to mortgage the historic Greystone she and my grandfather had spent a lifetime paying off. They took that massive $600,000 lump sum of hard-earned equity and handed it directly to Preston to feed his fraudulent Ponzi scheme. They willingly sacrificed the physical foundation of our actual family legacy to subsidize the lease on a scammer's luxury cars and country club memberships. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to pull up the specific details of the foreclosure notice. I scrolled past the standard banking jargon and penalty clauses to find the exact timeline of the default. The breath caught in my throat as I read the bold red text at the top of the final page. This was not a preliminary warning or a 30-day grace period notice. The bank had already exhausted all avenues of communication, and the legal foreclosure process was finalized. The public auction for Big Mama's historic home was scheduled for tomorrow morning at exactly 10 o'clock on the steps of the county courthouse. Preston had been dodging the mortgage payments for over a year, deliberately hiding the default notices from my parents, while simultaneously continuing to solicit new investments from their friends and fellow church members. My parents had effectively rendered their own mother homeless tomorrow morning to impress a man who was actively robbing them blind. The sheer callousness of mortgaging a vulnerable elderly woman's only sanctuary, just so Letitia could afford designer caftans and pretend to be an heiress, was unforgivable. My phone buzzed sharply against the mahogany table, violently interrupting my investigation. A new text message illuminated the screen. It was from Preston. The notification preview showed a tone of absolute unearned authority. I unlocked the device and read the message in its entirety. "We are having a family intervention at your office tomorrow at 9 a.m. Have your checkbook ready. Do not make me play hardball, Chloe. You owe Marcus, and you owe this family respect. See you tomorrow." The sheer delusion required to send a threat like that was almost pathological. He was a financially destitute fraud, sitting in a rented mansion, 90 days past due, on his own lease, orchestrating a massive federal crime, and he had the audacity to threaten a corporate crisis manager on her own turf. He genuinely believed his false patriarchal authority would force me into submission. He thought I was just a bitter younger sister who could be bullied into writing a check to cover up their messes. I did not panic. I did not cry or throw my phone across the room. Instead, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. Preston wanted to play hardball in the corporate arena. He wanted to bring his fragile house of cards directly into the fortress I had built. He had absolutely no idea the level of absolute destruction I was about to unleash upon him. I picked up my phone and bypassed my personal contacts entirely. I made 3 specific strategic phone calls to set the trap. First, I called my lead corporate attorney. I instructed him to draft an emergency wire transfer protocol and an ironclad property acquisition contract prioritizing Big Mama's address. I needed the legal framework established tonight so I could intercept the bank auction the second it opened tomorrow morning. Second, I called the senior director of my private wealth management firm. I bypassed the standard authorization queues and ordered the immediate liquidation of $700,000 from my blind trust. I needed liquid capital secured and ready to deploy at dawn to buy back my grandmother's legacy out from under the bank's gavel. Finally, I dialed a direct unlisted number I possessed from a previous high-stakes corporate embezzlement case. I calmly asked the dispatcher to be connected to the lead field agent of the local FBI white-collar crime division. When the agent answered, I did not hesitate. I introduced myself and informed him that I was in possession of a highly encrypted digital archive detailing a massive ongoing Ponzi scheme involving interstate wire fraud, money laundering through dummy corporations, and elder financial abuse. I told him the primary suspect was planning to walk directly into my corporate office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I offered to hand-deliver the entire criminal network to them on a silver platter. The digital clock on my sleek mahogany desk flipped to exactly 9 in the morning. My receptionist, Maya, chimed the intercom informing me my family had arrived and were causing a disturbance. I stood up, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my tailored charcoal suit. This was my armor. I walked out of my office, moving silently down the glass-walled corridor to observe the spectacle unfolding in my reception area before they noticed my presence. Preston paced aggressively across the marble floor, barking into his phone about offshore wire transfers. He wore a navy pinstripe suit that looked expensive but fit, poorly serving as a glaring metaphor for his existence. Marcus stood behind him, shifting his weight nervously, while wearing a pathetic, confident smirk, looking exactly like a stray dog hiding behind a larger predator. My parents stood shoulder to shoulder, radiating a misplaced sense of righteous indignation. Letitia trailed them, clutching a white pastry box, looking around my designed agency with blatant envy. Maya, a brilliant young woman holding a dual master's degree, sat rigidly behind the reception desk, trying to maintain her professional composure. Preston snapped his phone shut and slammed his hand flat against her counter. He demanded she fetch him black coffee and sparkling water, speaking to her with the slow, condescending cadence one uses with a disobedient toddler. I stepped out from the hallway shadow before Maya could utter a polite refusal. I told Maya she could take an early lunch and instructed her to clear the entire executive floor. I wanted 0 witnesses and absolutely no collateral damage for what was about to happen. My staff, trained to respond instantly to crisis management protocols, grabbed their laptops and vanished into the lower-level suites within 60 seconds. The quiet, productive hum of the busy PR agency faded into absolute total silence. My family stood in the center of the vacant space, looking momentarily disoriented by the sudden emptiness. Preston quickly recovered his false bravado and puffed out his chest. He marched past me without waiting for an invitation and headed straight for the main boardroom. He confidently pushed open the heavy double-glass doors and immediately claimed the large leather chair at the absolute head of the table, trying to establish physical dominance in a room where he held 0 actual power. Marcus scampered in and eagerly took the seat to his right, while my parents arranged themselves formally on the opposite side. Letitia sauntered in last, dragging her heels and assessing the expensive modern art on my walls. I followed her inside and pressed my hand flat against the thick glass doors. The heavy magnetic locks engaged with a loud, definitive click, sealing us inside the soundproof chamber. There was no way out and no one left to hear them scream. I walked to the opposite end of the long, polished table and remained standing. I did not offer them coffee water or the basic courtesy of a greeting. I just stared at them, letting the suffocating silence stretch until they began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Preston leaned forward, steepled his fingers together, and attempted to hit me with his best imitation of a seasoned Wall Street executive. He launched into a ridiculous, heavily rehearsed monologue filled with empty corporate jargon. He talked endlessly about leveraging familial synergy and creating a paradigm shift in our generational wealth. He spoke to me slowly, deliberately, misusing financial terminology, as if I were a clueless intern who needed to be educated on basic macroeconomic principles. He explained that Marcus had suffered extreme emotional distress and reputational damage due to my sudden hostile divorce filing. According to Preston, this required immediate financial remediation to avoid a lengthy, highly public court battle that would supposedly ruin the pristine reputation of my precious PR firm. Preston reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them across the smooth table toward me. He outlined his ultimate demand with a completely straight face. He wanted me to immediately liquidate my entire blue-chip stock portfolio. He generously offered to let me invest that newly freed capital directly into Preston Investments, LLC. He promised that his firm would guarantee a 20% quarterly return, which would automatically be funneled to Marcus to serve as his permanent alimony. Preston framed this blatant extortion as a brilliant strategic compromise, claiming my investment would solve Marcus' financial problems, solidify my parents' retirement goals, and ultimately save our family from public embarrassment. He sat back, crossing his arms, and waiting for me to capitulate to his masculine authority. My father nodded in stern agreement, completely oblivious to the horrifying fact that the man sitting across from him had already stolen his own mother's home. My mother looked at me with expectant, demanding eyes, waiting for me to pull out my pen and surrender my life savings to keep their fragile facade intact. Letitia let out a dramatic sigh and tossed her new accessory directly onto the center of the table. It was a pristine, shiny crocodile skin Birkin bag. The hardware gleamed under the recessed boardroom lights. I recognized it immediately as a $50,000 purchase. She had likely bought it yesterday to celebrate the massive influx of cash Preston promised her the moment he successfully intimidated me into emptying my brokerage accounts. She leaned back in her expensive leather chair, crossing her legs and looking at me with absolute, unearned superiority. Letitia smirked at me, her lips painted a bright, glossy red. "Just sign the papers, Chloe," she demanded, her voice dripping with arrogant condescension. "We are generously giving you a very easy way out of this massive mess. Preston is finally taking care of absolutely everything like a real man should. Do not throw a tantrum just because you are jealous of what we have built. Just sign the damn contract and do not be the stereotypical angry black woman ruining the family peace." The absolute vitriol in her voice hung in the sterile boardroom air. I let the suffocating silence stretch, allowing the sheer toxicity of her racist and misogynistic demand to settle over the polished mahogany table. My mother did not flinch. My father did not reprimand his precious eldest daughter for weaponizing a harmful stereotype against her own flesh and blood. They simply stared at me, united in their expectation of my total, absolute submission. Marcus cleared his throat, breaking the quiet tension. He adjusted his collar and leaned forward, attempting to project the aura of a reasonable, magnanimous man who had been terribly wronged by a hysterical woman. He looked at me with an expression of manufactured pity. "Chloe, I am willing to be the bigger person here." He began, his voice dripping with unearned grace. "I know you were highly emotional when you filed those divorce papers behind my back. You used a legal loophole to trick me out of my rights, and that hurt me deeply. But we shared a life together, and I am a man of faith. I am willing to forgive your deception." He laced his fingers together, resting them on the table, exactly mimicking Preston's predatory posture. If you write me a check for $100,000 today and sign over the deed to the downtown condo, I will walk away quietly. I will not drag your precious corporate reputation through the mud in a messy public court battle. I will just take my seed money, my condo, and leave you in peace. It is a massive bargain for you, Chloe. You owe me that much for blindsiding me. I stared at the man I had married. He was openly extorting me, demanding a six-figure cash payout and a $2 million penthouse in exchange for his silence regarding a divorce that was already legally finalized by a judge. He was negotiating a hostage release where the hostage was my own money. Before I could formulate a response that would not immediately expose my hand, my mother leaned forward. Her diamond bracelets clinked loudly against the glass tabletop. Marcus is being incredibly generous, Chloe, she stated, her tone laced with absolute authority. You have always been so rigid and selfish when it comes to family finances. It is time you actually contributed to the legacy we are building here. My father nodded vigorously in agreement, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. We made you into the strong, capable woman you are today, Loretta continued, her voice carrying the rhythm of a practiced sermon. When Letitia went to law school, we paid her tuition in full because she needed a clear mind to focus on her elite studies. When you went to college, we deliberately made you take out student loans. We forced you to work those terrible late-night retail jobs because you needed to learn how to struggle. You needed grit. We gave you that grit, Chloe. She looked at me as if she had just bestowed a profound blessing upon my life. We engineered your success by denying you the easy path. Because of our brilliant parenting, you are now a wealthy corporate director. Therefore, it is your duty to use the wealth we forced you to earn to support your sister and her husband. You owe us for making you struggle. It is your turn to carry the financial burden so Letitia and Preston can focus on executing their high-level investments. The twisted psychopathic logic of her statement was breathtaking. They were actively taking credit for the traumatic financial stress they inflicted upon me while using it to justify robbing me blind. My chest tightened, and for a fraction of a second, genuine rage threatened to crack my carefully constructed armor. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the heavy conference table and physically throw them out of my building. But I remembered the federal agents standing by. I remembered the forensic accountants waiting for my signal. I could not let them know I held all the cards. I needed them to put every single threat, every extortion attempt, and every fraudulent promise on the public record. I needed to let them hang themselves with their own arrogant words. I forced my shoulders to slump. I let my posture collapse inward, making myself physically smaller in the oversized leather executive chair. I looked down at my hands, allowing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I stood up slowly, my legs feigning a slight pathetic tremble. I began to pace the length of the room, wrapping my arms around my waist in a textbook display of extreme emotional distress. I let a single calculated tear escape and roll down my cheek. I looked at Marcus, then at my parents, projecting total, utter defeat. The room instantly relaxed. The predators smelled blood. I saw Preston smirk at my father, exchanging a victorious, knowing nod. They genuinely believed their coordinated psychological warfare had successfully broken my spirit. I stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the edge of the table. My voice trembled perfectly as I spoke. I just want this nightmare to end, I whispered, letting out a broken, defeated sigh. If I do this, if I liquidate my stocks and give Marcus the condo, will you all just leave me alone? Will the family peace actually be restored? Preston practically vibrated with greed. He stood up, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flourish. We just want what is best for the family portfolio, Chloe. He gestured to the thick stack of papers resting in front of him. I have the investment contract drafted and ready. It guarantees a 20% return on your liquidated assets paid directly to Marcus. It solves everything. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, acting like a wounded animal approaching a trap. Let me see the investment contract, I said, my voice meek and entirely compliant. Show me exactly what I am agreeing to fund. Preston smiled, a shark baring its teeth. He picked up the heavy document and slid it forcefully across the polished mahogany table. The papers glided over the smooth surface and stopped inches from my hands. As I reached out to pull the fraudulent contract toward me, I let my left wrist drop against the edge of the table. With one swift, imperceptible movement, I tapped the face of my smartwatch twice. I instantly activated a high-definition audio recording application that was continuously syncing every single spoken word directly to a secure remote cloud server. I stared at the thick stack of paper resting beneath my fingertips, letting my eyes dart across the dense paragraphs of legal jargon as if I were genuinely contemplating my surrender. The tiny green indicator light on my wrist pulsed faintly, confirming the digital trap was fully operational and recording every single breath in the room. My father, interpreting my silence as total submission, leaned heavily against the mahogany table. He clasped his hands together, projecting the solemn gravity of a patriarch delivering a sacred truth. "You have to look at the much bigger picture, Chloe," he urged, his voice thick with calculated emotional blackmail. Preston is standing on the absolute precipice of a massive multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal. This is not just some small-time investment strategy. This is the ultimate acquisition that will permanently elevate this entire family into the elite upper class. We are talking about true generational legacy wealth. We are talking about moving past the struggle and securing our rightful place among the city's elite power brokers. He paused to let his grand vision sink in, looking at me with pleading, desperate eyes. But massive deals like this require significant, immediate liquidity. He continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The market is incredibly volatile right now, and Preston just needs a temporary bridge to finalize the escrow. Liquidating your stocks is a great first step, but we need to ensure total, absolute financial security for the closing costs. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably before delivering his ultimate demand. "I really need you to take out a home equity line of credit against your penthouse. It is entirely paid off, and you have over $2 million in unencumbered equity sitting there doing absolutely nothing for the family. If you just take out a maximum HELOC to tide Preston over for a few short months, the return on investment will be astronomical. You will be the hero who helps secure our family empire." The sheer audacity of his request echoed loudly in my ears. They wanted my liquid assets to pay off Marcus and my hard-earned equity to fund Preston's failing Ponzi scheme. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the fraudulent contract, perfectly maintaining the illusion of a broken, intimidated daughter, weighing her final terrible options. I let out a long, trembling sigh and slowly raised my head to look directly into my father's eyes. "If this real estate deal is truly a guaranteed success," I asked, keeping my tone soft and deliberately hesitant, "why do you need the equity from my penthouse?" I tilted my head, projecting innocent confusion. "So where exactly did the money from Big Mama's house go, Dad?" The temperature in the locked boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. My father physically recoiled, his jaw dropping open in genuine shock. His carefully constructed patriarchal facade shattered completely, leaving behind the panicked expression of a man who suddenly realized he had stepped on a hidden landmine. My mother gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest as her diamond bracelets rattled together like warning bells. Letitia sat frozen in her chair, her arrogant smirk vanishing as the blood completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. Marcus simply stared blankly, entirely too dense to comprehend the magnitude of the bomb I had just casually dropped onto the table. Preston, however, reacted exactly as my psychological profile of him predicted. Instead of panicking or denying the accusation, he leaned his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a harsh, grating sound devoid of any actual humor. He genuinely believed he had backed me so far into a corner that my knowledge of his crimes was irrelevant. He thought my discovery was just a pathetic last-ditch effort to negotiate better terms before I inevitably signed the papers. "You really think you are so incredibly clever digging through public property records, Chloe?" He chuckled, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "You think you uncovered some massive, sinister conspiracy just because you know how to run a basic title search?" He shook his head, looking at me with pure, unfiltered condescension. You corporate public relations drones always think you understand high-level finance. Big Mama's equity was a stagnant, depreciating asset. I did what any brilliant, aggressive wealth manager would do in a shifting market. I strategically reallocated those residential funds to cover some unexpected short-term commercial losses on a separate portfolio. It was a necessary fluid capital transfer to protect the broader investment ecosystem. He was speaking rapidly, stringing together financial buzzwords to dress up the reality of his blatant criminal embezzlement. "And what about the money you are demanding from me today?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and terrified, feeding his massive ego so he would keep talking. "What about Marcus and his fake alimony?" Preston scoffed, waving his hand dismissively toward the man sitting next to him. "Marcus is a necessary administrative expense." He explained, his arrogance completely overriding his survival instincts. "The money you liquidate today will be routed through my firm under the guise of an investment. A portion goes to Marcus to keep him quiet about your divorce, and the rest gets utilized to clean up the ledger on my end. The commercial real estate market experienced a sudden liquidity crunch, and I need fresh capital to balance the books before the quarterly audits trigger any unnecessary regulatory scrutiny. It is basic corporate triage. You provide the cash injection, I stabilize the family portfolio, and everyone walks away wealthy." He confessed everything. Preston placed his hands flat on the table and leaned in close. The polite, polished businessman facade melted away entirely, revealing the nasty, desperate predator lurking underneath. His eyes darkened with pure hostility. "We are done playing these little games," he snarled, his voice dropping to a vicious, menacing register. "Sign the damn paper, Chloe. You owe us." The echo of his vicious command bounced off the soundproof glass of the conference room. I did not flinch, though the sheer malice radiating from him was palpable. Preston was no longer pretending to be the benevolent wealth manager rescuing a fractured family. He was a cornered predator, desperate and dangerous. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, the sudden violence causing Marcus to jump in his seat. Preston leaned so far forward I could smell the stale coffee and aggressive cologne clinging to him. He was ready to play his ultimate trump card, convinced it would completely break my resistance and force my total compliance. "You think you can just walk away from this family with your bank accounts intact?" he sneered, his voice vibrating with absolute venom. "You have absolutely no idea what I handle behind the scenes to keep this family afloat. Big Mama requires round-the-clock specialized medical supervision. I am the one paying for her elite private and home nursing care out of my own pocket. I subsidize those massive medical bills every single month to keep your precious grandmother comfortable and safe. If you do not sign that contract and authorize the transfer right now, I will cut off her funding today. I will cancel the nurses. I will stop the medical deliveries. She will be sitting in a severely underfunded state-run facility by Friday afternoon, and her rapid decline will be entirely your fault." The lie was so grotesque it momentarily stalled my breathing. Big Mama's care was fully funded by her own pristine medical insurance and a separate trust my grandfather had established decades ago. Preston was not contributing a single dime to her well-being. He was weaponizing a non-existent financial obligation to terrorize me. But before I could even process the depravity of his medical extortion, he launched his second coordinated strike. "And do not think your little corporate public relations firm is safe either." Preston threatened, his eyes narrowing into dark, hostile slits. "I play golf with the board members of your biggest accounts. I have an elite network of high-net-worth individuals who move markets. If you refuse to cooperate, I will personally ensure your agency is blacklisted across the entire city. I will start a whisper campaign so toxic that you will lose every major client by the end of the fiscal quarter. I will destroy your reputation and you will be professionally ruined." Letitia sensed the shifting power dynamic and eagerly jumped into the bloodbath. She was practically salivating at the opportunity to finally destroy me and elevate herself. She leaned across the table, her perfectly manicured nails drumming a frantic, aggressive rhythm against the glass. "Oh, we will do more than just ruin your career, Chloe. She spat, her voice shrill and vindictive. "If you do not write that check for Marcus, I will personally tell everyone in our social circle what a monster you truly are. I will call the country club, the church ladies, and your college alumni network. I will tell them all how your cold, selfish ambition drove your poor husband into a deep clinical depression. I will make sure everyone knows you are an emotionally abusive narcissist who discarded a good man the second he needed your support. You will be a complete social pariah." The sheer velocity of their cruelty was staggering. They were no longer a family negotiating a financial dispute. They had morphed into a pack of rabid dogs cornering their prey in a locked room. They were feeding off each other's toxicity, escalating their threats with breathless excitement. Letitia was vibrating with vindictive joy, her eyes wide with the thrill of the kill. Preston was red-faced and sweating high on the adrenaline of his own extortion attempt. Marcus sat beside them, nodding vigorously, his greedy eyes fixed entirely on the stack of financial documents separating us. They were entirely willing to destroy my career, ruin my reputation, and weaponize my grandmother's health just to subsidize their fraudulent luxury lifestyle. I knew the smartwatch on my left wrist was capturing every single horrific syllable with crystal-clear high-definition audio. The federal agents listening to the live cloud stream were likely securing their tactical gear right now, waiting for my signal. But the performance required a definitive climax. I needed them completely, utterly committed to the crime on the official record. I forced my spine to curve, allowing my shoulders to slump in a posture of total, absolute defeat. I let the fake terror wash over my face, widening my eyes and making my lower lip tremble. I looked exactly like a woman who had just realized she was completely trapped with no viable escape route. I turned my gaze away from the snarling faces of my sister and her husband. I looked directly at my parents, who were sitting silently at the center of the table. They had watched this entire psychological execution without uttering a single word of protest. "Mom, Dad," I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly to mimic a shattered spirit. "Are you really going to let him do this to me? Are you really going to let him threaten Big Mama like this just for a payout?" I stared at the two people who were supposed to protect me, giving them one final desperate opportunity to choose their daughter over their delusions of high society status. My mother shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her heavy pearl necklace. She closed her eyes for a brief second before deliberately turning her head away, staring blankly at the white wall of the conference room. My father cleared his throat and looked down at his expensive leather loafers, refusing to meet my gaze. "It is for the best, Chloe," he muttered to the floor, his voice completely devoid of paternal warmth. "You just need to cooperate with the family." Their silent complicity was the final nail in the coffin. They were actively co-signing my destruction without a second thought. The room held its collective breath, waiting for my surrender. I let out a long, trembling, defeated sigh that echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. I reached out with a shaky hand and slowly picked up the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen resting near the center of the table. The cool metal felt grounding against my clammy skin. I pulled the fraudulent investment contract directly toward my chest, aligning the pages with meticulous care. I uncapped the pen with a soft, definitive click and hovered the gold nib exactly 1 millimeter above the primary signature line. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, gripping the edge of the table as a massive, greedy grin stretched across his face. The heavy gold pen felt perfectly balanced in my hand as I let the nib hover a millimeter above the paper, casting a tiny, sharp shadow on the dotted line. Then I slowly lowered my hand and pulled the thick stack of documents closer to my chest. I flipped to the second page, furrowing my brow in a display of feigned confusion. I needed to keep them talking. The digital recording synced to my smartwatch was capturing every single breath, but a good federal prosecutor needed explicit, undeniable context. I had to force these arrogant fools to lay out the exact mechanics of their financial crimes on a pristine high-definition audio track. I ran my index finger down the list of clauses and let out a soft, hesitant sigh. "Before I transfer my entire life savings, I just want to understand the exact logistical mechanism here. I said, keeping my tone perfectly submissive and laced with a pathetic kind of reverence. You mentioned reallocating Big Mama's equity earlier. Just so I am clear, you are requiring me to deposit this new capital into the exact same holding account you used to drain her mortgage funds. I looked up at Preston, batting my eyelashes like a naive child seeking wisdom from a brilliant master. You are the financial genius here, Preston. I just want to make sure I am funding the correct offshore routing entity to bypass the domestic tax penalties you warned me about. Preston puffed out his chest, practically suffocating on his own inflated sense of superiority. He could not resist the opportunity to mansplain his own felony. Exactly, Chloe, he boasted, adjusting his silk tie with a smug grin. The primary holding company is registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation I established last year. I seamlessly funneled your grandmother's $600,000 home equity loan through that exact entity to avoid local capital gains taxes and municipal oversight. By routing your liquidated stock portfolio through the exact same offshore channel, I can effectively wash the origin of the funds. It completely shields the money from any federal scrutiny before it cycles back into Marcus' personal accounts. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing a profound lesson in economics. The recording was capturing a textbook confession of international wire fraud, money laundering, and the gross exploitation of an elderly relative. But I needed to lock Marcus into the conspiracy. I shifted my gaze to my ex-husband, who was still practically vibrating with greed. And Marcus, I asked softly, projecting an aura of complete surrender. How exactly does your podcast business factor into this brilliant strategy? I mean, if Preston is transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars to you, how do you explain that sudden massive income to the IRS without triggering an immediate audit? Marcus scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair and lacing his hands behind his head. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity, as if I were simply too dull to comprehend basic wealth management. It is called a consulting retainer, Chloe, he sneered, his voice echoing loudly in the locked boardroom. Preston set up my podcast as an independent limited liability company. On paper, my LLC provides exclusive high-level media consulting services to his offshore investment firm. We generate fake invoices for audio marketing strategies that never actually happen. Your payout simply gets processed as a legitimate vendor payment for services rendered. The money is entirely clean by the time it hits my domestic checking account. I avoid the brutal tax brackets, and Preston gets to write off your money as a corporate business expense. It is a bulletproof system. He had just cheerfully confessed to corporate tax evasion, invoice fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. My parents sat there listening to their son-in-law and their former son-in-law casually describe a highly coordinated federal racketeering operation, and they did not blink. They simply nodded along, completely mesmerized by the illusion of elite financial sophistication. Letitia was busy checking her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, totally indifferent to the fact that her husband had just admitted to risking decades in federal prison. I kept my eyes locked on the documents in front of me, pretending to carefully read the fine print of the indemnification clause. In reality, my focus was entirely fixed on the faint reflection visible in the thick, soundproof glass wall to my left. I was waiting for a very specific visual confirmation. The glass provided a perfect mirrored view of the outer reception area where Maya, my receptionist, had been instructed to wait. I needed to know the perimeter was secure before I dropped the final curtain on this pathetic theatrical production. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. I continued to slowly turn the pages of the fraudulent contract, dragging out the silence to maximize their discomfort. Then I saw it. In the reflection of the glass, Maya stepped into the center of the reception lobby. She stood perfectly still and raised her right hand, giving me a crisp, definitive thumbs up. The trap was set. The authorities were in position. The building was completely locked down. Preston lost his patience. The prolonged silence was chipping away at his fragile ego. He slammed his palm against the table, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the boardroom. "Stop reading the damn fine print and sign it, Chloe!" He barked, his voice laced with sudden aggressive hostility. You are not a lawyer and you have no idea what you are looking at anyway. Stop wasting my incredibly valuable time. Pick up the pen and sign the document. You owe us this money and you are going to pay it right now. I looked up at him. The mask of the terrified, submissive daughter melted away instantly. I did not glare or scowl. I simply smiled. It was a soft, terrifyingly calm smile that caused my father to suddenly shift uncomfortably in his seat. I picked up the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. I pressed the expensive nib firmly against the thick paper of the signature line. With 3 swift, deliberate strokes, I marked the document. I capped the pen with a sharp click, set it down, and smoothly slid the contract back across the long mahogany table. The papers glided perfectly, stopping right in front of Preston's clenched fists. He snatched the document aggressively, expecting to see my legally binding signature surrendering my entire life savings to his fraudulent control. Instead, his eyes locked onto the bottom of the page. Right on the primary authorization line where my formal signature was supposed to be, I had drawn a giant, perfectly round smiley face. The ink was still wet, gleaming under the boardroom lights. The sheer absurdity of the image completely short-circuited his brain. He stared at the crude drawing, his face rapidly turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage as he shoved the paper toward my face. I calmly watched the crumpled white paper flutter back onto the polished wood. The fake manufactured tears dried instantly on my cheeks. I slowly uncrossed my legs, planted my feet firmly on the floor, and stood up. The pathetic slump in my shoulders vanished completely, replaced by a rigid, commanding posture that I usually reserved for extremely hostile press conferences. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted immediately. I looked down at the red-faced man who had just spent the last hour threatening to destroy my entire life. "It is my review of your business model, Preston," I stated, my voice completely stripped of its previous terrified tremor. It rang out cold, sharp, and absolutely lethal. He blinked rapidly, his aggressive sneer faltering as his brain struggled to reconcile the broken victim from 2 minutes ago with the woman now towering over him. My parents remained frozen in their luxurious seats, their mouths slightly ajar, unable to process the sudden drastic shift in my demeanor. I raised my left arm deliberately, pulling back the tailored cuff of my blazer to expose the sleek metallic face of my smartwatch. The tiny green recording indicator was still pulsing steadily against the black digital screen. "I am a crisis PR manager," I announced, locking eyes with my father before shifting my lethal gaze back to Preston. "I handle billion-dollar public relations scandals. I manage hostile corporate takeovers. I deal with actual corporate psychopaths for a living. I routinely neutralize threats from ruthless international executives who possess 10 times your intellect and 100 times your net worth. Did you really think a cheap Ponzi scheme and a few coordinated guilt trips from my parents would actually break me?" The words hit the silent room like physical blows. Preston physically stepped back, his overwhelming bravado shattering as the horrifying reality of his situation began to finally dawn on him. He looked at my wrist, then down at the mocking smiley face I had drawn on his fraudulent investment contract. His mouth opened, but no actual sound came out. The arrogant, predatory wealth manager was suddenly utterly speechless. I leaned across the table, resting my palms flat against the cool, smooth glass. "I knew exactly what you were doing the moment you brought up Big Mama's equity," I continued, my tone conversational, yet dripping with absolute venom. "You left a trail of digital breadcrumbs a mile long. Your offshore holding accounts are incredibly sloppy. Your fake LLC vendor transfers are completely amateurish. I did not just run a basic municipal title search, Preston. I hired an elite team of independent forensic accountants to tear through your entire professional financial history. They have been quietly mapping your embezzlement network for 3 full weeks." Leticia finally broke the heavy, suffocating silence. She bolted upright, her heavy leather chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. "Stop it, Chloe," she screamed, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged. "Stop playing these ridiculous psychological games right now. You are making a massive mistake. You are going to ruin the family reputation over a simple financial misunderstanding. She reached across the wide table as if trying to physically snatch the smartwatch directly from my wrist. I easily stepped back out of her frantic reach, slowly crossing my arms over my chest. There is no misunderstanding, Letitia, I replied smoothly, maintaining eye contact. Your husband just explicitly confessed to federal wire fraud, extortion, and elder abuse on a pristine high-definition audio stream. And you happily chimed in with your own very specific threats of malicious character assassination. You are both going to be the absolute stars of a very public, very damaging federal criminal indictment. Marcus, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of the trap he had willingly walked into. His greedy dreams of a massive cash payout evaporated instantly, replaced by the terrifying prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence. He leaped from his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. "We are leaving," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the enclosed room. "I am not a part of this mess. I was just here for the standard divorce settlement. I am leaving this building right now." He spun around and sprinted toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. He grabbed the sleek metal handle and yanked it downward with all his frantic might. The door did not budge an inch. He pulled again, harder this time, throwing his entire body weight into the desperate effort. The heavy, reinforced glass rattled loudly, but remained firmly shut. He slapped the glass wildly, searching for a manual override lock that did not exist. "It is electronically and magnetically sealed," Marcus White informed him, watching his pathetic struggle with cold, detached amusement. "My receptionist Maya controls the primary security perimeter directly from the front desk. I gave her a specific visual signal exactly 4 minutes ago. This entire executive floor is currently on a total lockdown. Nobody leaves this room until I explicitly say so." The sheer panic in the boardroom suddenly reached a fever pitch. My mother started sobbing, genuine terrified tears burying her face deep into her trembling hands. My father stood up, his hands shaking violently as he pulled out his cell phone, desperately trying to dial his corporate lawyer. "No service," he gasped, staring at the blank digital screen in pure, unadulterated horror. "You jammed the cell signal," my father accused, his voice shaking with fear. "I did not have to jam anything," I replied calmly. "The conference room is a structural dead zone by design." The chaotic sounds of their panic, my mother's sobbing, Letitia's screaming, Marcus pounding futilely against the locked glass, suddenly faded. A sharp, melodic chime echoed clearly through the glass walls. The private elevator doors out in the lobby smoothly slid open. 6 men and women wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers bearing the bold letters FBI stepped directly onto the polished floor. The heavy footfalls of the federal agents echoed through the pristine reception area, creating a rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom that paralyzed everyone inside the glass conference room. My mother stopped sobbing abruptly, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the tactical windbreakers approaching our door. Letitia froze, her hands suspended in mid-air, her vindictive rage replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Preston looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute, his face entirely drained of blood, his jaw slack. The agents were moving swiftly, deliberately crossing the expensive marble floor with the synchronized precision of predators closing in on their trapped prey. We had maybe 30 seconds before they breached the magnetic seal of the boardroom doors, 30 seconds before the federal government officially took control of the narrative. I decided to use those final 30 seconds of absolute autonomy to finish the execution I had started. I completely ignored the approaching authorities, turning my back on the glass wall and focusing my entire lethal attention directly onto the man who had foolishly believed he could extort me. Marcus was still plastered against the locked double doors, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a coward's panic. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored blazer and withdrew a crisp, folded stack of thick parchment paper. It was a certified legal document bearing the official raised seal of the state court system. I held it up, letting the heavy boardroom lights catch the golden emblem before I casually tossed it directly at his chest. The thick packet hit his expensive silk tie with a satisfying slap before fluttering down to the polished floor, right at his trembling feet. He flinched violently, as if I had thrown a live grenade, backing away from the innocent-looking papers. "Pick it up, Marcus," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register that left absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. "Read the document you so arrogantly signed last month when you thought you were finalizing our standard default divorce." He slowly bent his knees, keeping his terrified eyes locked on my face as his shaking fingers fumbled to retrieve the papers. He unfolded the pages, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. His lips moved silently, trying to process the complex terminology, while the heavy footsteps outside grew louder. "You thought you were a brilliant strategist, Marcus." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You genuinely believed that because I filed the divorce papers quietly, I was acting out of pure emotional hysteria. You thought you could leverage my desire for privacy into a massive, lucrative alimony settlement. You sat there just 10 minutes ago demanding a $100,000 cash payout and the deed to my downtown penthouse, acting like you held all the leverage in the world. You thought you had outsmarted a woman who destroys corporate adversaries for a living." I let a cold, razor-sharp smile stretch across my face. "But you did not just sign a standard default divorce decree, Marcus. You were too lazy to hire a competent attorney to actually read the fine print. You signed a highly specific, meticulously drafted post-nuptial agreement that I personally designed with the most ruthless litigation lawyers in the city. You legally and permanently relinquished your absolute right to any spousal support, alimony, or asset division in the event of documented financial fraud. Because you just proudly confessed to a massive criminal conspiracy on a live federal wiretap, that clause is now officially activated. You get $0, Marcus. You walk away with absolutely nothing." The realization hit him like a physical strike to the stomach. His knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the back of a leather chair to keep from collapsing completely onto the floor. He looked at me with an expression of pure, agonizing defeat, the greedy, arrogant extortionist entirely replaced by a broken, pathetic shell of a man. But the financial execution was not quite finished. I took another step forward, closing the physical distance between us until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. Furthermore, I whispered, ensuring my voice carried clearly over the rising panic in the room. "Let us revisit that brilliant money laundering strategy you were just bragging about. You proudly claimed that Preston set up your podcast business as an independent limited liability company. You specifically boasted that you were the sole registered proprietor of that entity." I tilted my head, feigning a look of sympathetic concern. "Do you understand what that actually means in the eyes of the federal government, Marcus? It means you are not shielded by Preston's corporate umbrella. It means you are legally entirely responsible for the fraudulent corporate tax returns you filed to clean his embezzled cash." He stared at me, uncomprehending, his brain refusing to process the catastrophic reality of his situation. "Since you are the sole legal proprietor of the podcast LLC, you used to launder that stolen money. The massive resulting IRS tax liabilities belong 100% to you," I explained, articulating every single syllable with vicious precision. "The federal government does not care about your little backroom deals with Preston. They only care about the name on the official business registry. You willfully processed hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake vendor invoices and failed to pay the appropriate federal income tax on a single dime of it. The audit has already been triggered, Marcus. The penalties have already been calculated. With the compounding interest, the intentional fraud fines, and the back taxes owed, you are currently looking at a massive, inescapable financial deficit. Enjoy being $500,000 in debt, you parasite." Marcus let out a loud, broken wail and finally collapsed onto the carpet. He began loudly sobbing hysterically while desperately clutching his bare chest as his entire fake world completely and permanently disintegrated today. The magnetic locks disengaged with a sharp clack, cutting cleanly through Marcus' pathetic sobbing. 6 federal agents poured inside, moving with tactical precision. They secured the exits. The lead agent stepped directly toward the head of the table. She ignored my weeping ex-husband and my petrified parents. Her gaze locked onto the man frozen at the far end. "Please meet Agent Reynolds from the FBI," I said with bright professionalism. "She is the lead investigator for the Regional White-Collar Crime Division." Her team waited in the lobby, listening to our live audio feed. "They just needed you to explicitly confirm the offshore routing and Shell Corporation details before they officially made their presence known." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically against his expensive silk collar. He looked frantically from me to Agent Reynolds, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw oxygen into his suddenly restricted lungs. "What is this?" He choked out his voice, a weak, raspy shadow of its former booming arrogance. "You have absolutely no legal authority here. This is a private corporate meeting regarding a standard family wealth transfer. You do not have a single shred of actual evidence to justify this absurd intimidation tactic." I reached into my blazer pocket one final time and slowly withdrew a small silver USB drive. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the glare of the overhead lights. "You are wrong," I corrected him softly. "I have Big Mama's original digital ledger. You assumed my grandmother was just a senile old woman who blindly signed whatever documents you placed in front of her. You never realized she insisted on keeping a meticulous encrypted offline backup of every single real estate transaction and mortgage transfer you ever executed on her behalf. I spent 3 uninterrupted hours last night decrypting the contents of this drive. I combined her raw financial data with the comprehensive forensic accounting report my team finalized yesterday afternoon. Then I securely transmitted the entire devastating package directly to Agent Reynolds' personal secure server at exactly midnight. The last remaining traces of color completely vanished from Preston's face, leaving him a sickening shade of grayish white. His knees visibly buckled and he slammed both hands onto the table to physically support his own failing body weight. The arrogant, untouchable master of the universe was crumbling into pieces right before my eyes. But his deeply ingrained sense of elite superiority refused to die quietly. He desperately tried to cling to the singular weapon that had protected him his entire privileged life. "You cannot do this to me," he stammered aggressively, pointing a shaking finger at Agent Reynolds. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you know who my family is? My father plays golf with a federal judge every single Sunday. I personally manage the private investment portfolios for 3 active state senators. I am a fully licensed senior wealth manager at a prestigious domestic firm. You cannot just barge into my private boardroom and treat me like a common street criminal. One phone call to my legal team and I will have your badge stripped from your uniform by tomorrow." Agent Reynolds did not even blink. Her expression remained completely carved from stone as she stepped squarely into his personal space, entirely unfazed by his desperate name-dropping. "Your golf connections are not going to save you today, Mr. Sterling," she stated, her voice radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. "We have already secured a federal warrant to seize your offshore holding accounts and freeze your domestic assets. Based on the overwhelming physical evidence Ms. Hayes provided, combined with the explicit verbal confession we just recorded on the wiretap, you are officially under arrest. We have enough actionable proof to formally charge you with multiple counts of international wire fraud, corporate extortion, and aggravated elder financial abuse." "No," Preston shrieked, taking a stumbling, uncoordinated step backward until his spine hit the glass wall. "No, this is a mistake. You have to let me call my father. You have to let me call my lawyer." Agent Reynolds gestured sharply with her hand, and 2 male agents immediately flanked Preston, grabbing his expensive tailored arms with practiced, unyielding force. They spun him around, pressing his chest flat against the cold glass of the boardroom wall. Preston let out a high-pitched, undignified yelp of pure terror as they kicked his legs apart. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent room. The sound was the ultimate punctuation mark on his complete destruction. The arrogant, condescending man who had terrorized my family, who had stolen my grandmother's home, and who had attempted to steal my entire life savings was officially reduced to a sniveling, terrified criminal. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his silk tie was skewed, and his perfectly styled hair hung limply over his sweating forehead. He began to weep openly, large pathetic tears streaming down his face as Agent Reynolds began reciting his Miranda rights in a flat, clinical monotone. "You have the right to remain silent," she recited, watching coldly as the agents physically dragged him away from the table. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." They pulled him toward the open boardroom doors, his expensive leather shoes dragging uselessly across the carpet. He looked utterly pathetic, stripped of every single layer of his unearned privilege. I watched him take that humiliating walk of shame, feeling a profound sense of absolute justice settling deep into my bones. The monster was finally slayed. But the chaos was not entirely over. A sudden ear-piercing scream shattered the remaining quiet. Letitia, who had been sitting frozen in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly snapped. The realization that her unlimited credit cards, her designer wardrobe, and her entire luxury life had just been completely obliterated finally short-circuited her brain. She leaped over her leather chair, her eyes wide with a manic, feral rage. "You ruined my luxury life!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs. Her hands curled into violent claws as she launched her entire body directly across the table toward my face. "You destroyed my marriage and you ruined everything." I did not flinch as her manic scream echoed off the soundproof glass. I simply sidestepped her clumsy, desperate lunge, letting her momentum carry her forward until she crashed painfully against the heavy mahogany table. She scrambled to regain her balance, her chest heaving as she glared at me with wild mascara-smeared eyes. Her hands curled into fists, clawing at the polished wood as if trying to rip it to shreds. She looked completely feral, stripped of the carefully cultivated country club elegance she had spent her entire adult life perfecting. I looked down at her with a profound sense of pity, masking my absolute triumph. Reaching across the table, I picked up a thick manila envelope that had been sitting untouched next to my leather portfolio. I held it out toward her, suspended in the charged air between us. "Your life was already ruined, Letitia." I stated, my voice perfectly calm and deadly quiet. "You just refused to see it." She snatched the envelope from my hand, her painted fingernails tearing through the thick paper flap. She ripped out the documents inside her eyes, scanning the black lettering. Her rapid breathing suddenly stopped. The fluorescent lighting illuminated the exact moment her fabricated reality shattered into a million pieces. "You have spent the last decade parading around the entire city, pretending to be a wealthy and elite socialite." I continued pacing along the edge of the table. "You looked down your nose at my career choices, you constantly mocked my modest apartment, and you relentlessly flaunted your supposed generational wealth at every family gathering. But it was all a pathetic, hollow illusion." I pointed directly at the trembling papers in her hands. "That is a certified eviction notice from the property management firm that owns your suburban estate. Preston did not buy that sprawling house, Letitia. He has been renting it on a month-to-month lease for the past 3 years. And according to those certified documents, he has not paid a single dime of rent in well over 6 months. The federal marshals are changing the locks on your front door as we speak. You thought you were living the dream while your husband was embezzling money from his own clients just to keep the lights on in that house. He drained your joint savings accounts. He liquidated your stock portfolios. He even took out a predatory third mortgage on the summer cabin your parents gifted you for your wedding anniversary. Every single luxury vacation you bragged about, every lavish country club dinner you hosted, every expensive piece of jewelry you flashed in my face, was entirely funded by stolen money and massive debt. You are not a wealthy socialite, Letitia. You are practically bankrupt and entirely homeless." She violently shook her head, refusing to accept the harsh reality. "No," she gasped, dropping the eviction notice onto the floor as if it burned her hands. "No, Preston is a senior partner. We have millions tied up in offshore trusts. He promised me we were invincible." He absolutely lied to you, I countered, stopping my slow pacing to lock eyes directly with her. He lied to everyone, but mostly he lied to you because he knew you were too shallow and too obsessed with your social status to ever question where the money was coming from. If you do not believe the legal documents on the floor, I suggest you take a look out the window. I gestured toward the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that offered a view of the street below us. Oh, and look very closely, Letitia. It is a spectacular view. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before scrambling toward the glass. She pressed both of her palms flat against the cold pane, leaning her forehead heavily against the smooth surface as her frantic eyes quickly scanned the busy street traffic far below. A gasp escaped her throat. In front of the entrance to my office building, 2 tow trucks were blocking the valet lane. One truck was already hoisting her leased Range Rover onto its flatbed. The second tow truck was hooking chains beneath the sleek Porsche. The yellow lights of the tow vehicles reflected brightly against the office buildings, broadcasting their financial failure to the downtown district. You do not own those vehicles, Letitia, I reminded her, watching her shoulders begin to tremble. They strictly belong to a high-risk luxury auto leasing firm, a firm that despises delinquent payments. You have 0 assets remaining to your name. Every single thing you ever thought you possessed was just a cheap rented prop, perfectly designed to mask your deep insecurity. You spent your life trying to prove that you were the successful golden child of this family. You sacrificed human decency and family loyalty just to maintain a facade of superiority. I walked back toward the table and picked up her handbag. I dangled the accessory by its handles. Even this bag is a joke, I noted, tossing the purse onto the table where it landed with a thud. It is a counterfeit, Letitia. A fake just like your marriage and your life. You are holding a Birkin bag, wearing designer clothing, and staring out a window while your rented cars are repossessed. The finality of my words finally broke through the barriers of her denial. The ultimate status-obsessed golden child was out of excuses and out of delusions. She stared at the tow trucks pulling away from the curb, carrying the symbols of her wealth down the street. Slowly, her legs gave out beneath her. She slowly slid down the smooth surface of the cold glass wall, her expensive silk dress bunching up awkwardly around her waist. She sank to her knees on the carpet, utterly humiliated. Her hands dropped to her sides and she stared blankly ahead, paralyzed by the destruction of her world. She was finally forced to face the bitter truth that she had nothing left. My mother Loretta and my father Marcus Sr. stood paralyzed against the far wall of the conference room. Their meticulously crafted worldview, the arrogant belief that their golden child had secured their place among the city's elite, had just been violently dismantled in under 10 minutes. They watched the federal agents march their supposedly brilliant son-in-law into the elevator in handcuffs, and they watched their perfect daughter weeping on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her fake life. The heavy silence in the room was only broken by Letitia's pathetic, gasping sobs. I turned my attention away from the crumpled woman on the carpet and fixed my gaze directly on the 2 people who had spent my entire existence making me feel like an unwanted burden. The sheer terror radiating from my parents was palpable. The smug superiority they had carried into this boardroom was entirely gone, replaced by the panicked desperation of cornered animals. My father was practically vibrating, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room before finally landing on me. The realization of exactly who I was and what I possessed suddenly hit him like a freight train. I was no longer the disappointing scapegoat they could bully into submission. I was a highly successful crisis PR manager with the exact resources, wealth, and connections they desperately needed. Chloe, my mother whispered, taking a hesitant, trembling step forward. Her voice was shaking, pitching up into a frantic whine. You have to stop this. You have to fix this right now. You know people in the government. You handle these kinds of media scandals all the time for your corporate clients. You can make a few phone calls and get Preston out of custody before the press gets a hold of this story. She reached out her hands, trembling violently. You have the money and the power to spin this narrative. You have to hire the best defense lawyers in the city to bail him out and protect the family name." My father nodded vigorously, stepping up beside her to reinforce the delusion. "This is a public relations nightmare, Chloe," he stammered, his voice thick with panic. "If the country club finds out about this, if the bank goes public with the fraud allegations, our reputation will be completely destroyed. We will be laughingstocks. You have to use your firm to bury this scandal. You owe it to this family to protect us from this disaster. You have to save your sister from this humiliation." I stared at the two people who had given me life, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. Their incredible audacity to demand my protection after actively participating in my attempted financial ruin was staggering. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "You want me to launch a multi-million-dollar crisis management campaign to save a man who just tried to steal my life savings?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. I stepped closer to them, forcing my father to instinctively back away. "You sacrificed me my entire life to feed Letitia's massive, fragile ego. You constantly belittled my career, you mocked my independence, and you treated me like dirt, just so your precious golden child could feel superior." I pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my father's chest. "But that was not enough for you. You handed the only real legacy this family possessed to a criminal because he wore a nice suit and promised you entry into a country club you could never afford. You turned a blind eye while he drained my grandmother's equity and lured me here today to feed me to the wolves." I shook my head. "I am not lifting a single finger to help you. You do not have a reputation left to save. You are just a pair of foolish, greedy enablers who bet your entire lives on a shiny lie and lost everything." My father's tough patriarchal facade instantly crumbled into dust. The authoritative man who had belittled my ambitions for decades suddenly looked like a terrified child. Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. "But Chloe," he cried out, his voice cracking with genuine agonizing despair, "you do not understand the timeline. Preston used Big Mama's house as collateral for massive high-risk commercial loans and completely defaulted. The grace period expired yesterday. The bank is foreclosing on Big Mama's house today." He grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket, his knuckles turning white. "We ignored the final warning notices because Preston swore he was getting your investment money this morning to cover the outstanding balance," he sobbed openly, begging me with wide, terrified eyes. "We packed all of our things into boxes and moved into Big Mama's house last week when Letitia's landlord started asking questions. We do not have anywhere else to go, Chloe. The sheriff's deputies are coming to execute the foreclosure order this afternoon. We will be homeless by dinner time. You have to help us. You have the money. You have to pay off the bank." I did not say a single word. I simply turned away from his weeping face and walked calmly across the long conference room toward my heavy mahogany desk. The sound of my heels clicking against the floor felt like a ticking clock marking the final seconds of their desperate reality. My parents and my sister watched me in breathless, agonizing silence, praying that I was retrieving my checkbook to save them from their own catastrophic greed. I bypassed the leather chair and opened the top right drawer of the desk. Reaching inside, my fingers brushed against the crisp, heavy parchment I had securely stored there 3 days ago. I pulled out a single, perfectly embossed real estate deed, and then I slowly turned back to face the absolute wreckage of my family. My father stared at the thick parchment in my hand, his tear-streaked face frozen in a mask of absolute confusion. I stepped away from the heavy mahogany desk and walked back toward the center of the boardroom. The room fell into an absolute silence, broken only by the shallow, ragged breathing of the people who had always tried to tear me down. I placed the document onto the glass conference table and pushed it forward. The heavy paper stopped just inches from his shaking fingertips. He looked down at it as if it were a live, explosive device. "Read it," I commanded, my voice echoing with a cold detachment that made my mother flinch. "Read the top line out loud so everyone here can finally understand how this story ends." He hesitated, his hands trembling violently as he reached out to touch the embossed seal. He squinted at the dense legal text before finding the designated line. He cleared his dry throat. "It is a deed of trust," he whispered, his voice cracking under his terror. "But it lists a corporate entity, a blind trust. I do not understand what this means. Why do you have this?" I let a slow, razor-sharp smile stretch across my face. "It means the bank is not foreclosing on anyone today, Dad. There are no sheriff's deputies coming to drag you out onto the street today. The bank no longer holds the note on Big Mama's historic house. I used a blind trust to purchase the entire mortgage debt from the lender yesterday. I bought the defaulted loans for pennies because the bank was desperate to offload Preston's toxic assets before the federal indictments went public. I own the debt. I own the property. Big Mama's historic house is now fully paid off and legally registered in my name." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. My mother let out a dramatic gasp, covering her mouth as her knees buckled. My father gripped the table, his knuckles turning white as he processed my words. "You bought the house?" he stammered, a spark of hope flaring in his eyes. "You paid off the entire mortgage? Oh, Chloe, thank God. You saved us. You saved the family home. We knew you would not let us end up on the street. We knew you would do the right thing for your family." I raised my hand instantly, cutting off his pathetic attempt at reconciliation. "Do not mistake my actions for a rescue mission." I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip through the tense air. "I did not do this for you. I did this for Big Mama. She worked her entire life to build that legacy, and you handed it over to a sociopathic con artist just because he bought you expensive dinners and promised you a membership to a pretentious country club. You were completely willing to let her die in a state-run nursing facility while you lived rent-free in her stolen home. Big Mama is safe now. She is moving back into her primary bedroom tomorrow morning with a team of full-time private nurses that I am personally paying for. Her home is protected from your greed forever." The spark of hope in my father's eyes instantly extinguished, replaced by a dawning, horrific realization. "But we moved all of our furniture into the guest rooms," my mother cried out, stepping forward with her hands clasped together in desperate prayer. "We gave up our apartment lease. We have absolutely nowhere else to go, Chloe. You cannot just kick us out into the cold. We are your parents." I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years criticizing my appearance, minimizing my career, and praising the toxic sister who was currently weeping on the carpet. "But you two are officially evicted," I stated, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "You have exactly 2 hours to hire a moving truck and get your belongings out of my property. After that, my private security team will place everything you own into garbage bags and leave them on the curb. You can go live in whatever cheap, cramped apartment Letitia manages to afford now that her fraudulent luxury lifestyle has been incinerated. Perhaps the three of you can share a single bedroom and reflect on your brilliant life choices." "You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood," my father yelled, his face flushing with a sudden, impotent rage. "After everything we did to raise you, after everything we sacrificed for you." "You sacrificed me," I corrected him fiercely, stepping directly into his personal space until he was forced to look away. "You sacrificed my mental health, my self-esteem, and my childhood just to feed Letitia's bottomless ego. You treated me like a broken, defective prop in your perfect family fantasy. And when the truth finally came crashing down, you still tried to force me to clean up your mess. Well, I am done cleaning up your messes. You traded a loyal, highly successful daughter for a fraudulent illusion because you were too shallow to recognize real value. You bet your entire existence on a shiny fake Rolex, and now you have lost absolutely everything." I picked up my leather portfolio from the table and turned my back on them. "You are no longer welcome in my life," I said, walking toward the heavy boardroom doors. "You are no longer welcome in my properties. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my office. If any of you ever attempt to contact me or Big Mama again, I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing." I pushed the doors open, stepping out into the bright reception area of my firm. Behind me, the sound of my parents' agonizing weeping filled the conference room. It was the sound of complete, absolute ruin. They were finally forced to face the dark reality of the world they created. The glass door swung shut behind me, cutting off their pathetic despair. I stood in the sleek marble reception area, smoothing my blazer as I took a long, steadying breath. Through the transparent walls of the boardroom, I watched the final act of their destruction play out with absolute clinical precision. Two building security guards flanked my weeping mother and my completely broken father. They guided them toward the service elevators, sparing the main lobby from their breakdown. Letitia stumbled blindly between them, her fake designer heels dragging across the carpet, her mascara running down her face. She looked vacant, stripped of the golden child persona that had defined her miserable existence. Ahead of them, the federal agents were processing their captives. Preston was practically hyperventilating as they marched him forward, his handcuffs catching the overhead lights. Marcus was hauled alongside him, his shoulders slumped in defeat, muttering pleas to the FBI. They paraded past the workstations of my crisis management team. My staff stood in stunned silence. They had spent the hour monitoring wiretap feeds and executing the property transfers. Now they watched in awe as their boss systematically dismantled a criminal conspiracy and eradicated her toxic bloodline before lunchtime. I offered my associates a curt nod, signaling the operation was concluded. They returned to their desks with reverence in their eyes while I walked toward my private office. I closed the heavy oak door, leaning against it, letting the silence wash over my skin. Crossing the room, I stepped up to the massive windows offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The sun cast a golden glow across the skyscrapers reflecting off the lake. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling a surge of absolute liberation. For years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family's impossible expectations. I endured their endless criticisms, swallowed their favoritism, and allowed them to use my successes to mask their failures. I married a man who viewed my ambition as a threat and ultimately tried to extort the wealth I sacrificed my youth to build. Looking out over the city, I realized the chains were permanently broken. I was financially secure, answering to no one but myself. I was free from a parasitic husband who would spend the next decade navigating the federal prison system. I was liberated from a toxic family whose greedy demands would never reach my ears again. The reflection staring back at me was not the scared scapegoat they always wanted me to be. It was a fierce, independent woman who had meticulously engineered her own salvation. I took the skills they mocked and used them to orchestrate the most flawless execution of my career. I protected my assets, secured my future, and severed the infected branches of my family tree with precision. There would be no more ruined holidays listening to Letitia brag about leased cars. There would be no more family dinners watching my father praise a con artist while ignoring my legitimate accomplishments. There would be no more sympathetic glances from a mother who lacked courage to defend her own flesh and blood. They made their choices, and I simply delivered the unavoidable consequences. The silence in my office was not lonely, it was rich and satisfying. It was the sound of complete autonomy. I walked slowly to my desk, running my fingertips across the polished wood. My career was thriving, my investments were insulated, and my soul felt lighter than it had in decades. The shadows of my past were gone, replaced by the unyielding light of my own truth. The crisp ringing of my cell phone sliced through the quiet calm of my office. I glanced at the glowing screen resting on my desk. The caller ID displayed a picture of Big Mama smiling brightly on her porch. A genuine smile broke across my face, replacing the tactical mask I had worn all morning. I picked up the device and accepted the call. "Hello," I answered, my voice softening into a tone reserved for the one person who ever truly loved me without conditions. Chloe baby Big Mama's voice crackled through the speaker, rich with familiar southern warmth and layered with razor-sharp wit. "I have been sitting here waiting by the phone all morning. Did you take out the trash, baby?" I let out a soft, genuine laugh, feeling the remaining tension evaporate from my shoulders. The casual brilliance of her question perfectly summarized the entire morning. She knew exactly what I was doing today, and she knew exactly who the real targets were. Yes, Big Mama, I replied, leaning back against the edge of my desk and looking out at the bright skyline one last time. The trash is officially out. The house is completely clean and the deed is sitting right here in my hand. You never have to worry about those parasites ever again. I heard a deep sigh resonate through the phone receiver. That is my brilliant girl, she said, pride swelling in every syllable. You did good, baby. Real good. Now tell me you are not going to sit up in that fancy high-rise office all day working yourself to the bone. I stood up and reached for my winter coat draped across the leather armchair. I am done for the day, I promised her, slipping my arms into the sleeves and grabbing my handbag. I am coming home right now. Did you save me some of that famous gumbo you promised me? Big Mama let out a loud chuckle that resonated straight into my heart. I made a massive pot just for you, baby, she declared, her voice radiating pure love and finality. Drive safe. We have a lot to celebrate, and there are absolutely no plates for losers tonight. I ended the call and tucked the phone into my pocket. I took one final look around the quiet room, then opened my door and stepped out into my bright, beautiful future.